Good morning, everybody. Thank you all for being here on this Saturday morning. And it's a real honor to have the various people who will be speaking on the panel throughout the day. But it's an even greater honor to have those of you who didn't have a speaking role and chose to come anyway. We are here at Georgetown in the historic Riggs Library. For over 230 years, Georgetown has sat on this hilltop overlooking the seat of power of the United States of America. It has used that vantage point both to engage the policy process. The proximity to power has allowed us to have the kinds of people, some of whom will be speaking to you over the course of the day, to be part of this university community. But it has also used that remove, just far enough away from the swamp, as it were, to use our analytic judgment, our academic rigor to examine that policy process and to ask the questions about how we can make the process work better. For much of the 200 years, India has not necessarily been a featured part of the conversations at Georgetown. I'm happy to say that across this university, from our business school to our law school, policy school, medical school, the college and the School of Foreign Service, and even our colleagues in Doha, India is now a central part of the conversation at Georgetown. And the Georgetown India Initiative, which I have the honor of directing, was founded and launched officially by the President's Office in November of 2015. We are just about a toddler, right, a year and a half, but I think we are capable of doing pretty amazing things, as today's conference, I think, suggests. We invite all of you who have ideas about how we could do better engaging the diaspora community, engaging the policy community, to come talk to me, talk to any of the amazing students who are really the heart of this initiative and responsible for the conference today. There's a number of my faculty colleagues here as well. Come let us know how we can do better and what we can do working with you. We'd especially love to meet any of you who have a checkbook that you'd like to sort of help support the cause, right? We take all sorts of credit cards and everything. You have the information about the amazing bios of all the speakers today, so I won't do that, but I do want to start by introducing to you a friend of the university, Mr. Arun Gupta. Arun is a partner at Columbia Capital. He will be co-teaching a class in the MSP this fall, and then in the winter will be teaching his own class. So those of you who have the ability to take a class with him, you have a resource quite amazing in terms of expertise in the private equity markets and also long engagement professionally with India. So without further ado, please welcome Mr. Arun Gupta.
Thank you, Irfan. It's my privilege to introduce two close friends who will be kicking off today's event. First, I'd like to introduce Ambassador Richard Verma. Ambassador Verma served as the 25th United States Ambassador to India. He was nominated by President Obama in September 2014. As ambassador, Rich oversaw one of the largest U.S. missions in the world, including 4 consulates across India and nearly every agency of the United States government. During his 2-year tenure, U.S.-India relations experienced a significant resurgence, with important gains made in defense, trade, and clean energy. The ambassador managed an unprecedented 9 meetings and 3 summits between President Obama and Prime Minister Modi, leading to over 100 new initiatives and more than 40 government-to-government dialogues. He was previously Assistant Secretary of State for Legislative Affairs, where he led the State Department's efforts on Capitol Hill. He worked in the Senate for many years, serving as the National Security Advisor to the Senate Majority Leader, and he also worked in the House of Representatives. Ambassador Verma received his Master's of Law from right here in Georgetown Law School and was recently appointed to SFS Centennial Fellow. Ambassador Verma, in my mind, is truly one of the more grounded and thoughtful people you'll meet in politics. Next, I'd like to have the privilege of introducing a close friend who I've known for over 18 years. Professionally, politically, and personally, Senator Mark Warner. Senator Warner is a second-term U.S. Senator who serves on the Senate Finance, Banking, Budget, and Rules Committee, as well as a Select Committee on Intelligence, where he is the Vice Chairman. And we've all seen this on the news. During his time in the Senate, Senator Warner has established himself as a bipartisan leader who has worked with Republicans and Democrats, novel concept, alike to cut red tape, increase government performance and accountability, and promote private sector innovation and job creation. His bipartisan leadership has never been more needed than in today's political climate. In addition, Senator Warner has always been a close friend to India and the Indian American diaspora here in the United States. still remember dating back to his early support of the Indian CEO High-Tech Council in the late 90s, Senator Warner was one of the first non-Indian supporters to really support the organization. Senator Warner serves as a co-chair of the Senate India Caucus since 2011, where I've had the privilege of serving on his advisory board. And the India Caucus is the first country-specific caucus established in the Senate. Recently, Senator Warner has been working to strengthen the defense and defense trade relationships between the two nations. Senator Warner is also engaged with India in the promotion of U.S.-India trade since his time as governor of Virginia. In 2005, he was the first U.S. governor to lead a trade delegation to India, if you think about that. Not until 2005 had any U.S. governor led a trade delegation to India. From 2002 to 2006, he served as governor of Virginia. When he left in 2006, Virginia was ranked as the best state of business, the best managed state, and the best state in which to receive a public education. Now that's a real example of a successful business person bringing business management practices to government. The first in his family to graduate from college, Senator Warner spent 20 years as a successful technology and business leader in Virginia before entering public office. An early investor in the cellular telephone business, he co-founded the company Nextel, is also a co-founder of Columbia Capital, and has invested in over 100 emerging technology companies that have created tens of thousands of jobs. Senator Warner is a close friend of high integrity who brings pragmatic bipartisan business leadership to our national politics and has a deep understanding of India and the Indian diaspora. And with that, Senator Warner and Ambassador Verma.
Well, thank you, Arun. Thank you for your friendship. Thank you for that kind introduction. And I have to tell you, your daughter made the absolutely right choice to wear that pink tie this morning. It was very good. I also want to commend those of you who are students who are here who are willing to put on a tie on a Saturday morning. For the others, I'm glad you're looking official. I'm in my Saturday politician outfit, so not with the tie. Professor Nurudin, thank you for what you're doing here. I have to acknowledge when you say here at Georgetown, where you're slightly removed from the swamp. I acknowledge to the couple of students who escorted me up that I actually went to school in the swamp. I went to that bad school down the street, George Washington. So when it was occasion to get up here at Georgetown was always a great opportunity. And to my good friend Rich Verma, who has done so much for our country, both here and obviously his service as ambassador. Had the opportunity to visit India while Rich was ambassador. And thinking about all of those titles you've had, I think probably the current administration has not filled any of those titles you've had, right? So maybe you could go back in any one of those roles. But that's maybe a subject of another matter. Let me also introduce Milan Dalal, who is on my staff, who helps work on not just issues in terms of the U.S.-India caucus, but is my key guy on banking and financial issues. So anybody who's got Dodd-Frank reforms, make sure you see Milan. This is a really interesting opportunity and an interesting time, I think, for U.S.-India relationships. Remember Arun's comments when I first got involved with the India High-Tech CEO Council back in the late 80s, as in this region, a lot of Indian American entrepreneurs, it was kind of a coming of age at that point of the Indian American diaspora. And I'll always remember one of the first receptions for the Indian High-Tech CEO Council. We held it at the British Embassy, and it was kind of the event to be at that point, 89, 90. And the British ambassador was going on, waxing eloquently as only ambassadors can, about this incredibly, robust and growing relationship between the UK and India, and how this great relationship of mutual respect. And then it came turn for the Indian ambassador to speak, and the Indian ambassador was the epitome of kind of a grizzled, older diplomat, And he got up to the stage and simply said, you know, Mr. Ambassador, thank you so much. If you and Britain had only any of those views over the last 300 years, maybe our relationship would have been better between the India and the UK. But it was a wonderful moment. It's a kind of thing from a historic and other standpoint. Now, in terms of India and the United States, the relationship is long. It has had its ups and downs, but I can't think of a bilateral relationship, frankly, that has improved more. Maybe Rich, when we get to our conversation, we can talk about this. You know, India and the U.S. in the early 1990s, while they weren't necessarily adversaries, it would be hard to call us friends. Yet over the last 25, 27 years plus, this relationship has matured from a kind of tentative friendship to a strong relationship to now, from the United States standpoint, and I believe from India's standpoint, it is one of the top 1, 2, or 3 important bilateral relationships for our country and for the world, for stability, not only in Asia, but frankly as India's footprint economically and culturally spreads all across the world. It really is extraordinarily important. And Arun mentioned, I'm really proud of the fact is I've been co-chair of the U.S.-India Caucus, Senate Caucus for the last 4 or 5 years. And the U.S.-India Caucus is actually the single largest bilateral caucus in the Congress. Most folks might say it would be some other country. No, we have 40 plus members in the Senate. I'm not sure how many they've got in the House, but who cares about the House anyway? You know, and it is, I know just this week I'm going to be meeting again with a delegation coming from FICCI, from one of the India Commerce organizations, and it's a very, very important opportunity. I wanted to stand here before the ambassador and I sit down, because I do want to kind of give a state of where I think the relationship stands, you know, both what the good side is, what some of the challenges are, and what some of the opportunities are. From kind of just a snapshot at the metrics, if you think about U.S.-India relationships and you just measure it in economic terms, we've really seen bilateral trade between our two countries really emerge in a dramatic way. Back 16, 17 years ago in 2000, bilateral trade was about $19 billion. It's now up to about $110, $115 billion. And there has been a joint, I think, which we'll talk about this a little bit, aspirational goal to try to get those numbers closer to $500 billion. You know, that's a really, in terms of growth of trade, I'm not sure, candidly, whether there's any U.S. Or any bilateral trading agreement that's growing at the rate of the collaboration between the United States and India. One area that Arun mentioned that I've been trying to focus on is defense trade with India. Right now, India and the United States, India is our second largest defense trading partner. Again, that is a dramatic shift from not only 25 years ago, but even from 16 or 17 years ago, when the vast majority of defense trade with India was India-Russia. Now it is India, the United States, and that is important in terms of joint military operations. It's in terms of, you know, our combined challenges with terrorist threats. But where we've seen this movement has been both in the C-130s, C-17s. We've seen our Apache helicopters. These are all areas where there's been actual trade take place and important movement forward. One of the things that I think has helped reset the stage was when former Defense Secretary Ash Carter was a little bit lower down in the food chain. And I think, Rich, you were ambassador when this was all set up, where we set up the Defense Technology and Trade Initiative, or DTTI. That really tried to shake up state and DOD to say we really need to rethink our whole relationship with India, not only as a trading partner in the defense area, but actually as a defense partner. And one of the things that I'm proud of that we were able to do with Milan's help and others in the last Congress was actually build that framework of DTTI into the defense authorization bill. So it's not only just kind of a one-off or one administration policy, it's now built into the law as an ongoing framework of where we, how we should proceed on an administration to administration basis in terms of defense trade with India. Now, there's still challenges. We've got to make sure, one of the areas that I've been very active in, both domestically and also now vis-a-vis this special relationship with India, is to see if we can increase the amount of sale and actual intellectual capital collaboration around unmanned systems, drones in particular. There's the Defense Department and others are still a little bit slow on, within defense and state, there's these whole series of classifications you have to get through before we can actually sell equipment. We're trying to keep moving India up the food chain. Ideally, I could eventually see us kind of treating India almost like one of our Five Eyes partners, which is our closest allies. And I think that ought to be an aspirational goal for U.S.-India defense collaboration, because, again, so many areas are each country's normal national interest co-align. Even if we may have at times bumps in that relationship, both in terms of protection in South Asia, in terms of both the major powers, two of the major powers in the world, stabilization. We've got, if we're going to continue that, we've got to make defense trade a key and essential component of that. The other area that is that I think is a challenge and opportunity is, as the Indians rethink their Indian Air Force jet purchases. There was a while, and how do I say this politically correctly? I think, Mr. Ambassador, help me. Nothing the Indian government does on a procurement path is ever done quickly. Is that a good line? That was well. So there was a while it looked like American aircraft were going to get bumped out, and that the Indians might go with the French or elsewhere. They have reopened that acquisition in terms of jets, and Lockheed actually, in a very bold move in terms of potential sale of jets, has talked about moving their whole production line to India to try to get one of those contracts, which obviously fits very closely in Prime Minister Modi's kind of Make It in India program, which, boy, sounds a little bit similar to the our current president's programs as well. But that kind of movement forward is something that I think I'll be curious to watch to see whether an American company can be that critically important and successful in such a major defense acquisition program. And and one of the challenges I think we have, as an editorial comment off to the side, is that particularly when we're selling to a country like India, the Indians want to make sure that the relationship between the United States and India is so solid that no kind of potential blip could come along, and whereby then the United States might hold back on selling replacement parts. It's great to sell those initial planes, ships, what have you, but if you've got to have a solid enough relationship that no kind of minor blip could end up stalling the replacements, which is a legitimate concern on behalf of the Indian government. So again, it's my goal in the caucus, and I think it's continue to be the challenge from the Indian community side of the table, to make sure that we don't allow individual blips, whether they are, and we've had a few of those in the last couple of years. I think about the case of the Indian ambassador with the nanny issue in New York that kind of maybe got elevated beyond its actual importance in geopolitical, but we've got to make sure in any mature relationship we're going to have those kind of challenges, but how do we make sure that it doesn't question the overall framework so that we can make sure that this partnership continues in a major way. Another issue I think we've got on the defense side is, I completely understand the Prime Minister's goal to make it in India, but I've heard from particularly the American companies that even if they want to partner with India in all these areas around defense, there are certain areas where the Indian capacity, the intellectual capacity may be there, but the Indian capacity to actually make all of the components is still a struggle. So India has a 30% domestic quantity offset. This is not unusual for most emerging nations to have some notion that we want to make part of the product domestically. One of the things we've been trying to work for some time on is that we're not asking India to change their 30% defense offset requirement, but if we're not able on a particular piece of hardware to get to 30% right now, maybe we've been urging India to look at saying, we'll still do that 30% offset, but if we can't do it all on an aircraft carrier, we can't do it all on an airplane, let us, India, identify other areas where there are needs. We think about workforce training, we think about infrastructure, we think about a host of other areas that are still in the national interest of India, and let us provide American domestic Indian content in those areas until the capacity grows to 30%. And while we've seen, this is kind of getting in the weeds for a Saturday morning, I know, but it's really pretty important stuff. We've seen the Indian government make an incremental step towards these efforts by allowing, in effect, consulting services and software services. Our hope is they'll even think broader on the whole offset issue. Let's talk for a moment about Indian economic growth. The fact is, India is actually at now, I think last quarter, 7.1% GDP growth. That's the highest in the world. And unlike our friends in China, that I would argue sometimes their numbers are a little more questionable about their GDP growth. Not saying we always 100% all the numbers coming out of India as well, but relative to China, it's a little more transparent. That 7.1% growth is pretty remarkable. And you think about that, even with the prime ministers, and I think we'll probably talk about this in the conversation, very bold move towards demonetization, which for those of you who've not followed it was a great idea, move quickly, but think about it as a comparison in terms of its rollout. The rollout of demonetization approached the Obamacare website rollout. So that gives you a little context. Good idea, but even with that challenges of the rollout of demonetization, where you basically took certain rubies where there had been lots of graft, took them out of circulation with virtually no notice. Unlike in America, where there was still kind of a hangover about the Obamacare rollout, in India, I think the vast majority of the population, even though it was a rocky period of time, acknowledged and give credit to the Prime Minister for taking such a bold move. And while there was a number of bumps, the fact that it only took a couple of fractional percentage points out of GDP with this radical currency transition really is a credit both to the Indian people and Prime Minister Modi's, I think, leadership. Two last comments before we'll move this to a conversation. One, in terms of the overall kind of India-U.S. geopolitical relationship. As I mentioned earlier, clearly, I think in both countries, it has taken leadership on the Indian side to acknowledge that, hey, simply being the leader of the non-aligned movement might have been cool in the 90s, but maybe in the 21st century, India needs to maintain its independence and have its own foreign policy, but simply being a leader of non-aligned does not make sense when you've got an aggressive Pakistan, when you've got an emerging China. You need to throw in a lot in a geopolitical way. And the choice for India to kind of move its alliances more Russia-focused to more United States-focused is terribly important. From the U.S. standpoint, the overall shift to Asia that President Obama announced, I thought was the right one. The challenge going forward, and again, we'll probably talk about this in the conversation, is with a movement towards TPP, which I may be one of the few remaining senators who still support, both from not only a trade standpoint, but frankly from a geopolitical standpoint. When you're talking about 40% of the world's population that would have been encompassed in TPP, and that without India's inclusion even, or without China's inclusion, but would have still allowed, I think, American values, and for that matter, transparency, labor rights, environmental rights, to kind of set the framework for trade policy in Asia. Unfortunately, since we've moved away from that under President Trump, we're going to have to, I think we're still sorting that out. The idea that we're going to do a series of one-off bilateral relationships as our trading, as our trade policy going forward is going to be hard. But if that is the kind of hand we're dealt at this point, one area that we ought to move forward with, and I know the ambassador was supportive of this, is this wouldn't be a full-fledged comprehensive trade agreement with India, but the first step would be what's called a bilateral investment treaty, a so-called BIT. India has BITs with a number of countries. This really is about investor protection, and is something that I hope will be high on the new administration's agenda. So we've got to continue to move forward on that. Because let's face it, in the interim, if America steps back, if India steps back, the Chinese are not stepping back. They're, what's it called, the New Silk Road, Modern Silk Road effort to kind of link China on a transport route all the way over towards Pakistan and Afghanistan. Terribly important. China's kind of pearls, I think they call it pearl, something of sea bases, naval bases, including a naval base and Chinese port facility in Pakistan, needs to be of concern both the United States and obviously of India. Finally, in terms of, I can't be here without making a couple of quick comments on the U.S.-Pakistan relationship and the India-Pakistan relationship. I was one of 24 senators last year who voted against the full aid package and the sale of jets to Pakistan. And I did that with some reluctance. I know how critically important Pakistan is, but the fact that Pakistan continues to sanction, LET and the Haqqani network that both provide disruption in terms of coalition forces in Afghanistan, the fact that Pakistan does not have complete control over even all its own territorial integrity, the fact that Pakistan has allowed at times terrorists to go into India, and I think India has shown remarkable restraint. Could you imagine a President Trump, if he had been Prime Minister of India when the Mumbai attack took place, what potentially would have happened? And Prime Minister Modi obviously comes kind of more from the center-right side of Indian politics. I think he has been restrained. I fear, though, that we could be one or two events away from that restraint falling away. So how we can continue to urge Pakistan to move beyond its obsession with India, whereas I think India has kind of moved beyond its obsession with Pakistan and sees itself as a regional and global power. It's unfortunate that many forces in the Pakistani government still uses the potential conflict or fear of India, I believe, almost as a way to curtail its own population's aspirations. That's not long-term good for the Pakistani people, and this is an area that is going to require continued focus. And where this comes to a head in many ways is in Afghanistan, where any Indian involvement. I remember one of my trips a little bit before we came to visit India. I was in Afghanistan, and what India was doing was not only economic support, but was literally training 1,000 Afghani civil servants. And in a country like Afghanistan that lacks so many kind of basic civil society orders, that was as valuable a contribution as any kind of military support. Yet that very action was viewed with such huge suspicion by Pakistan. So this is an area that, while maybe not immediately on the front page, and except during days of budget, not budget, but mothers of all bombs being dropped, this is still an area of enormous concern, I believe, in terms of the overall India, Afghani, Pakistani relationship and U.S. relationship. final comment is just there are still bumps. I mean, we've got an ongoing challenge with the issue of the H-1B program and how we get this right. I've been a supporter of H-1B visas, but I also acknowledge there are firms, both Indian firms and American firms, that game the system. And while I'm not generally a supporter of Mr. Trump, I'm at least open to seeing his review of the H-1B programs to make it more talent-based rather than lottery-based is something I think worthy of examination. So we've got that issue to sort through. We've got the issue continuing to sort through about, from as relatively mundane about the number of Indian Americans who collect Social Security who move back to India who then never receive any of the benefits. Something that we've got to think through. I believe that Indian American diaspora, though, which we talk about as one of the great assets in America, the 3 million plus Indian Americans who live in this country and contribute now. It's come a long way since the Indian High Tech CEO Council and kind of the emergence of the Indian American diaspora to now where Indian Americans play an incredibly important role, not just in technology, but in the arts, in business, increasingly in politics. So this is a great asset for both countries. An asset that sometimes I don't think we take full advantage of, and hopefully we'll get to this in the conversation, is the reverse diaspora. There are 250,000 plus Indian Americans who've gone home to India for retirement. They still carry an American passport. And I think one of the real opportunities would be, how do we take that returning diaspora back to India who have knowledge of both countries and use it in a reverse manner? I would have loved to have seen if we could have initiated a kind of a junior ambassador program where every Indian ambassador, Indian American who went back to India, received some kind of pin, and no matter where they lived, continue to be an advocate for stronger U.S.-India relationships and ties. So enormous opportunities, yes, some challenges, but boy, oh boy, have we come a long way in 25 years. And I believe the future of the Indian-American relationship is not only strong, but absolutely critical to the national needs of both countries. And my hope is, in my role in the Senate, that I can play a role in making sure that we foster that growing relationship and make it one of the quintessentially important relationships for both countries in the 21st century. So with that, thank you, and we'll go up to the conversation.
That was pretty amazing summary of the U.S.-India relationship, and I just warn you to be careful because there's very few people that know as much as you do. They're looking for a U.S. ambassador to India right now, and I'm sure they would love to get you out of the Senate.
The administration might want to get me out of the Russia investigation role and send me to India. So just,
in all seriousness,
I should also, in the age of live streaming,
yes,
remember everything you say can and will be used against you at some point. That was just a joke, that last comment. So.
I'm aware of live streaming, live tweeting. In India, it's pretty relentless, and it's so we'll try to keep you out of trouble. I actually just want to go back. We kind of take it for granted that you've been this huge advocate for the U.S.-India relationship, and you worked on the CEO High Tech Council, and you noted the Senate India Caucus is the biggest in the Senate and very successful. The House India Caucus, I know we don't care about the House, but actually the largest,
it's the largest
caucus in the House. Can you just give us some sense of, A, why you think they've been so successful and popular, and B, why you personally wanted to be involved?
Well, let me start with the personal side, and then I'll move to the kind of more macro side. My wife's brother-in-law, my brother-in-law, has lived, he's 65, he got out of college, went to South Asia as a Peace Corps volunteer in Nepal, and never came back. So he's lived in India, he's lived in Pakistan, he lives right now in Bangladesh. So kind of from my own personal family standpoint, we've always had some connection and affinity to India and the region writ large. And as Arun mentioned back in 2005, partially due to the fact that I had both business partners and lots of friends in the Indian American community in Virginia, they all are saying, hey, Mark, every governor in the world is going to China. Nobody's going to India.
Right.
And it was, to me, just from a kind of cultural affinity, I love Indian food. It's from the whole idea of this is a natural relationship. I tried to avoid the normal talking point that every politician says, the two worlds, the world's oldest democracy and the world's biggest democracy and shared values. We kind of gloss over that, but those are terribly important. I know from a business standpoint, it's a real challenge to kind of break through the Indian bureaucracy. But if you do break through the Indian bureaucracy, you at least have rule of law. You don't always have those guarantees in China. So I always thought this was a natural relationship and natural cultural affinity that needed to be taken advantage of and developed. And it's also been, the Indian American community is also so relentlessly successful. And I'm trying to decide how I can tell this story in a way that passes politically correctness muster. I was sitting with the kind of co-founders of the Indian High-Tech CEO one night, and this is back in the late 80s, and having a few glasses of wine, and somehow the kind of subject came up of, golly, the Indian American community is so successful and everybody's done so well. And one of our mutual friends said, well, in India, if there was like the American High-Tech CEO Council and all Indians saw were Americans that were graduates of Harvard and MIT, Indians would think all Americans are successful as well. So there was, what we've had for a long time is kind of the best of the best from IT and other institutions coming into America. But I think sometimes what I'm trying to be somewhat sensitive to this because, like in any immigrant community, not every Indian American is a venture capitalist, a lawyer, a doctor, or a CEO. There are swaths of the Indian American community, just like as in any community, that are still struggling in this country. So that notion of overgeneralization, but it's been, I think, fortunate, but you can be grossly overgeneralized when Americans look and say, boy, oh boy, there's been no immigrant group that's been more successful than Indian Americans.
Right. It's a really good point. The community has obviously a lot of success, but there are people still trying to make it and haven't made it. What's interesting, you mentioned H-1Bs, which is really kind of the policy byproduct of kind of a larger maybe blowback against immigrants generally, which was a big topic of the campaign. And one of the things we pick up for the first time is this community, whether you call them Indian Americans or South Asians more broadly, maybe feeling somewhat uncomfortable, perhaps unwelcome for the first time. And I just wonder how much of that is from the campaign, how much of that will go away, what do political leaders need to do? Governor Romney used a really interesting phrase last year. He said we got to watch for trickle-down racism. There's trickle-down economics, there's also trickle-down racism, where people hear political leaders say certain things about immigrants, and then it kind of opens the gates, and all sorts of things are acceptable. What would you say to folks who are thinking about coming here or are here and are feeling somewhat uncomfortable?
I think, Rich, that's an extraordinarily valuable point. And to be fair, it just didn't start with the campaign. Think about the massacre a few years back at the Sikh temple in Wisconsin.
Right.
But we have seen, and this is probably not a news flash, particularly to the students in the room, an upsurge post this last campaign of racist or inappropriate comments. I mean, the killing of a young Indian in Kansas a while back with somebody shouting, "Go back to your country."
Right.
in periods of economic uncertainty, you do see whether nationalistic or anti-immigrant strains. As challenging as they are here, I think it still pales to what's taking place in France and to a degree in the UK, and we'll see what happens in Germany as elections move forward. I think those of us, from a policy standpoint, have to speak consistently and strongly against that kind of anti-immigrant flavor, that against, hey, if you look slightly different, go home. No, the truth is, the Indian American community in many ways is second and third and fourth generation. There is no more,
Right.
There is no home other than this country.
It sounds like you can disentangle the kind of legislative needs of immigration reform, H-1B reform, from this overall kind of
But one of the things,
anti-immigrant sentiment.
again, kind of trying to say this appropriately, we all have to be sensitive of others as well, An Indian American who says, if somebody is being racist or calling you and the response can't simply be, no, I'm not Muslim, I'm Hindu, isn't a good enough answer. And let's also acknowledge that this is not just an American issue.
Right.
Prime Minister Modi's party, and while I think the Prime Minister has generally been good on these issues, I think even Prime Minister Modi could do more on this kind of cross, at least religious conflicts in India itself. I mean, India will never be strong until it's, 180 million plus Muslims beyond the smaller percentage of Sikhs and Christians and all feel truly Indian. But this is not a problem that I think that's going to go away with any single election cycle. And we're going to have to, policymakers are going to have to be able to speak out more often. I think, cross-culturally, religious leaders, one of the good days, there's been some challenging days with this new administration, but one of the good days was right after the president's, I think, ill-thought-through, ill-informed Muslim travel ban,
Sure.
Which they tried to pretend was not a Muslim travel ban. My staff made the awful mistake of scheduling me to be in Richmond instead of my home in Alexandria on Super Bowl Sunday. And so I'm down in Richmond, and I'm going at this Islamic Center cross-religious rally on Super Bowl Sunday afternoon. I thought there'd be 50 people there. I'm going to do a drive-by before I go watch the game somewhere else. Get there, and it's Christian, Jewish, Hindu, Muslim. I think there were some folks from the Sikh faith tradition as well. And instead of 50 or 75 people, there were 1,500 people.
Wow.
In a neighborhood in Richmond. And they couldn't do it inside this small hall. It was all outside, and people of all faiths and traditions coming forward and saying, this is not who we are as Americans. So for what we need to reinforce is for every one of these incidents, racist, nationalistic incidents to come out, I still believe the vast majority of Americans do not view that as our country. And we need to tell more of those stories of those interfaith rallies than simply the stuff that makes the news.
Let me go back to the geopolitical for a second, and you touched on it in your remarks, and it was great to see you out in India several times over the last few years. You've really been a champion on this. But if I could maybe summarize kind of our policy over the last couple of years, it's in a sentence that Prime Minister Modi said to the Congress last summer when he gave a joint address. And he said to the members of Congress assembled, he said, it is in your strategic interest, in America's strategic interest, for India to be strong and prosperous. Mm-hmm. In other words, if we're in good shape economically and strategically and militarily and politically, that's good for you, America. And I think that formed the basis of our let's say, breakthrough over the last few years, because we got away from the transactional, what's in it for us, what's in it for us. Now, fast forward to where we are today, and if we have a foreign policy, for lack of a better term, is based on America first, as if other presidents didn't think about America first. But really, it's not based on how you're doing. It's based on, is it going to be good for us? Have we changed our fundamental view about how we think about India? Is this going to set us back? And if so, what can the Congress do about it?
Great question. If one thing we've seen, at least with President Trump, is he's got a flexible foreign policy. If he was able to completely be educated about North Korea, China's relationship with a 10-minute conversation with President Xi, we need to maybe get Prime Minister Modi over here very quickly so that he can make that point in a more visceral way that, frankly, that a strong India, a strong democratic India is a bulwark in the region where you have, a democracy's demise in Pakistan, where you have a fragile or feeble at best democracy in Afghanistan, where you've got one-party rule in China. And, absolutely, India's strength is a great counterbalance, I think, as an ally, because America cannot bear it all alone.
And do you think Congress, whether it's through major defense partner, as you led that effort in the defense authorization bill, and Congress can play a role in kind of reminding the administration of this?
Yes, I think we can.
Okay.
I think we have to. I think there are what I would say, though, is that on at least the kind of economic front, we can't allow the H-1B program to be the only point. Two comments. One, I remember one of my trips over to India, sitting with the commerce minister at the time, and he was kind of saying, I was then governor. He's going, Governor, you're a high-tech guy, you get globalization, you understand this, pushback on H-1B and outsourcing of work. It's just the nature of where the world's moving, and you have to help us fight back against those tendencies in America. And I said, yeah, I get that, but it would also be really great if you would open your retail sector to foreign direct investment. And he said, oh, Governor, that would cost us millions of jobs, and that would disrupt the whole village economy. Right. So there needs to be a little bit of recognition both sides. Sure. And as an advocate of H-1B, and H-1B advocate, but even more an advocate for students coming out from a STEM field who want to start a business here in America. I did something called the Startup Act with Jerry Moran, which would have, the old kind of staple the green card to anybody with a STEM master's degree or anybody that wants to start a business here, rather than pushing talent back home. I'm still all for that, but I've learned enough about the H-1B program to know that there are companies, both Indian and American, that simply use the H-1B program as a labor arbitrage. Yeah. And those examples we've got to cut down on and reform, or the whole program is too easily to be attacked.
Got it. I think we're already over time, and your staff's gonna kill me. So I'm gonna take the liberty of maybe asking the last couple questions, and I think I'd be derelict in my responsibilities if I didn't ask you a question in your vice chair of the Intelligence Committee hat, and whether you could give us an update on where the investigation into Russia kind of meddling in the election is, and where you think the timeline is, and are you concerned with what you've found thus far?
Mr. Ambassador, I'd love to tell you, but I'd have to kill you. No, let me tell you what we do know. What we do know is that Russia massively intervened in our election. And this was not the first time, but they had been practicing these techniques in Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, in Hungary and Bulgaria and elsewhere for some time. And in some of those countries, they've done it in a way that is extraordinarily more flagrant, recognizing kind of your incredible meteoric and pure rise. If somebody were able to break into Rich Verma's all their personal email accounts and everything else, they'd find nothing of any problem.
Most of my emails are on the internet already,
And
because
so
I worked in the State Department
You
for
were,
2 years. Yeah,
that's,
so.
right. That's right. You were in that Hillary Clinton. Right?
Yeah, right.
But yeah, what they've done in other countries is if they find nothing embarrassing, they literally will. This has happened, I think, to was a Hungarian parliamentarian, where they would place a child pornography file
Right.
on your account, and then call the local police and say, go check out Arun Gupta's Facebook account. You might find there's some pretty nasty stuff. So we.
Yeah.
But just
That was an example.
that was an example.
Yeah, right.
That's why you and I are talking up.
Right,
not
right.
around. But they hacked into both parties. They released information on one party. They released things to embarrass Clinton. They, somewhere in the middle of the campaign, they decided that they not only wanted to embarrass Clinton, but they wanted to help Trump. That in itself, people should have, regardless of who you support, people should have been more upset about that. And then what they also have done, which is pretty chilling, is they had, and this would be one of the audiences that would fully understand this, they had more than 1,000 paid internet trolls. And these trolls would create bots where they would create large numbers of false Twitter and Facebook accounts. And they would then, and this is the part that we're not 100% sure on, but they could actually flood the zone with fake news on a geographic location. So this is still being proven out, but it appears that in states like Wisconsin and Michigan, where the Democrats were too asleep at the wheel to realize they were close, if you happen to be a young woman in that last week of the election and you only got your news not from TV or the newspaper, but from your Facebook news feed, you didn't receive information that said Clinton does this and Trump does this. You got Clinton is sick. You got Clinton has got, stole $6 billion from the State Department. You've got even the one that particularly made my head explode, and probably any of you who live in the region, that there was a sex ring going on at Comet Pizza,
Right.
in the basement, in a building that had no basement. So you had this kind of intervention, and then on top of that, what you also have are at least a number of figures that were affiliated with the Trump campaign who've had what seemed to be an unusual number of ties with Russians. So our goal is, if there's nothing there, I'll be the first to stand up and say there's nothing there. And that will remove this cloud from this administration, which, needs to be removed if nothing is there. If there is something there, we got to follow the intelligence. And we've got to do it in a bipartisan way. This is so important to our democratic process. We absolutely have to get it right. And last comment on this is that, and it really is two last comments. One is, if you add up what the Russians did in the United States, if you add up what the Russians did or didn't do in the Dutch elections recently, where in the Netherlands, they counted every ballot by hand because of their fear of Russian intervention. If you add up in a much more flagrant way what the Russians are doing right now to intervene in the French elections, both for Le Pen and now for Mélenchon, the communist candidate, is unprecedented. I saw the head of the German state security services recently, and this has been publicly announced. The Russians have hacked into the whole Bundestag, the whole parliament, and they've got German elections coming up. If you add up all these activities, and you put a price tag on all of this, you have less than 2% of the cost of an aircraft carrier. So, when people ask me and they go through the litany of, China and North Korea and Iran and Russia and, what's the biggest challenge? I would argue it may not be any single nation state. It is the vulnerabilities we have in the cyber world, and the asymmetrical ability for some nation state or even bad actors, terrorists or others, to really attack us, and not just in the sense of we're going to steal your intellectual property, or as the Chinese perhaps have done, stole our stealth technology, when they're attacking our most democratic process, it really is, we all ought to be offended. And what is particularly challenging, and again, this is not my words now, this came from public testimony of the Senate Intelligence Committee, where one of the experts said, it didn't help matters when one of our two presidential candidates, then candidate Trump, was basically stating in his public comments the exact words of what the Russians wanted to provoke in America. Russia wants to undermine democratic processes all throughout the West, because the more they can split our countries, and it's happening right now in France, even more so in America, into far left and far right, that is both helpful because Putin is not pro-Republican. He wants to make America less strong economically, socially, and he also wants to use this as a propaganda device to his own people to say, hey, look at these democracies, they are all internally corrupt. And when then candidate Trump, up until election day, kept saying the elections are rigged, that was exactly the kind of language that Russian propaganda wanted to spread. So I'm going to give the president the benefit of the doubt until we find otherwise, but we have to become all more aware and more aware consumers of information. And I say this as a former tech CEO, I think we're going to have a really serious policy debate about the role of all these platform companies and their ability to kind of say they bear no responsibility for the information that's passed on. We're in a brave new world here, and we're going to need to figure this out. And it has ramifications not just here, but across the whole world. Sorry to get
No, thank you.
excited.
That's very, very, very helpful. Truly, last question, and be no surprise to you that election campaigns are getting longer and longer, especially for the big seat at 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue. It's also no surprise that your name periodically gets mentioned in a very positive light. And I just wanted to give you the opportunity, if you wanted to have the Georgetown India Initiative be the place where you wanted to create any news on that front, we would certainly welcome that. If you've taken a decision, I just want to give you the chance.
And you're my friend?
Right.
Let's just, I just want to see if we can get our GDP growth rates up to that 7.1% as well. But no, I got a job to do in the Senate. I think that two quick comments. One, the U.S. or the Russia investigation may be the most important thing I ever do in public life. And getting that right is so important to our people maintaining faith in our democratic process. And that's got to be done in a bipartisan way. That is my number one agenda item. The other thing, though, that I am working on that I'd love to engage with this audience or you and others on, I've shared some of this with Arun, I believe that part of the kind of, not just in America, but throughout the West, and I think you'll increasingly see it in India as well, is there's a growing lack of faith that particularly modern American capitalism, is working for enough people.
Right.
And so you've got this veer off on one side on nationalism, you've got this veer off on the other on total redistribution. It almost feels like both political parties are looking backwards instead of looking forward. So how can we change the political debate framework? If we can make the debate about making capitalism work for everybody again, that'll be much more productive than simply relitigating all of the old issues. Again, honestly, most politicians already have established positions on tax reform and health care and everything else, and they're not going to change them. But if we could say, very briefly, if we could say, hey, the truth is, for all of you who are students here, 95% of you are never going to work for the same firm for 38 years the way my dad did. Already a third of the workforce in America is in some form of contingent work. Part-time, gig workers, wannabe entrepreneurs, independent contractors. We have no social insurance for those programs because we have a system that was based on long-term permanent employment. How do you create a portable benefit system that would meet workforce where it is? How do we think about a frame around low and moderate income people? If you're at Georgetown, I care about you, but frankly, you're going to do fine. What I care about more or equally is that 50, 60% of Americans who are in low and moderate income jobs, many of those jobs who are at jeopardy of being destroyed by technology, by globalization, and there is no economic incentive right now for any company to invest in upskilling people in those jobs. And honestly, government does a pretty crummy job in workforce training. So how do we incent businesses to take people, say, below $60,000 and invest in their training? Third is, I did pretty well, along with Arun and stuff, in the free enterprise system. But something is wrong in our free enterprise system when the average hold on a public stock has gone from 8 years to 4 months. When the chasing of short-term, immediate returns, I think, destroys long-term value creation. And when companies are driven by, you got to make that 4 cents the next quarter, or you will get rid of your workforce training program, you get rid of your research program, that capitalism eats itself up. Short-termism versus long-termism is a valid argument that ought to be debated. And then finally, the place that gives me hope, and it again goes back mostly more to millennials than folks like us, is I do think increasing number of millennials, and I think increasing number of particularly pension funds with long-term time horizons, want to invest in companies, or young people want to work for or buy from companies that have some level of social value to them, where they treat their workforce well, where they think about the environment. If government tried to set metrics here, we'd screw it up. But why not challenge all of the B Corp and SASB and Just Capital and Conscientious Capitalism, and all these groups are out there. Let's go put a $100 million X Prize out there. Set a metric and let the market work. Let pension funds invest and vote with their dollars. Let us as consumers and you as future employees vote with your own dollars and where you choose to work. I think the market will reward businesses that treat their workforce with some level of respect. And I think they can do that in a cost-effective manner, but we have no way to measure it. So if we could debate those issues, that would be a heck of a lot more productive than what I'm doing at my day job currently.
I got it. Thank you for being so candid with us. Thank you for being here. Thanks for your leadership on all these issues.
Thank you.